Welcome to the Working Well podcast. I'm Tim Boris, CEO of Fresh Wellness Group. This show explores the diverse aspects of workplace health and personal performance. On the Working Well podcast, we dive into the foundations of what makes wellness work in workplaces around the world. We connect with corporate leaders, executives, and industry experts who are helping make life more awesome at work and home. Join us to learn workplace wellness best practices, personal performance tips, and access resources to jumpstart your personal and corporate programs. Lindsay Lapaquette works with middle managers who want to communicate authentically so they can effectively lead their teams without losing themselves. As a former speech-language pathologist with a Master's of Applied Science, Lindsay harnesses her expertise in the neuroscience of communication and connection to help managers foster an environment of trust and respect in their teams so that everyone can bring their best selves to work. Lindsay's approach has been profoundly influenced by her work with First Nations organizations, her experience as a parent of two neurodivergent children, and the premature loss of both of her parents. Along with an unquenchable thirst for learning, Lindsay brings to her work extensive experience in emotional regulation, trauma-informed de-escalation, collaborative problem-solving, mindfulness, cultural proficiency, and nonviolent communication. She is passionate about helping people foster a deeper connection to both themselves and others. Lindsay, welcome to the Working Well podcast. It's so awesome to have you on the show. I'm really excited to chat with you about the neuroscience of effective leadership communication. Before we dive in, how have things been the last 15 months for you? I know it's been, to put it mildly, a crazy year and a bit. What does life look like these days?
It has been a crazy year. And I think certainly a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about, I can certainly link to them as we're going through, because I think a lot of the challenges that I've been experiencing personally, at home, in my business, reflect challenges that businesses are going through. So on a personal level, we have been homeschooling the kids. As with many, business certainly took a hit as the pandemic started off, and I had to pivot, like so many say, put a lot of time and energy into reflecting on my business model. And I'm really happy with the direction that things have changed to, but it's certainly been a lot of work and a certain amount of stress. And like I said, I find my clients have been experiencing similar challenges themselves in the past year and a half.
Absolutely. And as an expert on communication, it's every time you open your news feed, it must be like, here's another example of what we talk about every day.
Yes, the pandemic has certainly highlighted our communication challenges. And I will say that in the first few weeks, just to observe what was going on a communication level on social media, I thought I just need to step back because this is intense, and it has settled somewhat. But I think some of the nuances of those challenges pre-existed the pandemic and continue to today.
Sure. And just put a magnifying glass up to the things that weren't working and made it that much worse. Now we're 15 months into it. What things have you seen that are resolved or better resolved and that people have adapted and done really well with? What are some of the wins, I guess you would say? That's a great question.
Well, so I think in my perspective, the pandemic has certainly brought a lot of awareness, I think, to people around where their real priorities are in life, around where they are happy, the things that they don't want to settle for anymore. I think both on an employee level and on a business, on a leadership level too. I think it's really led people to ask themselves those hard questions and stop sort of just making decisions in that rote, automatic way that a lot of us were prior to the pandemic. And my hope is that as this settles, we'll take those lessons forward.
Yeah, and we're seeing that, I guess, come to a head a little bit over these next few months when businesses are starting to bring people back into the office, and some companies are starting to mandate people have to be back in the office a certain days per week. And there's a new term that was coined by a researcher, I think, or a professor, and they said it called it the I can't remember, the great, like not the Great Recession, but the Great Quitting. Basically, up to 40% of people want to switch jobs because people haven't wanted to transition during this pandemic, and now as things open up, they feel there's a little more security, and there's going to be the great transition, I think it was called, because so many people are going to be looking for new jobs, and companies that aren't flexible in having people back to the office are at much higher risk of losing employees.
Yeah.
And a huge part of that goes back to communication. So what have you seen around how people are communicating some of those challenges?
Well, so if I can actually, just before responding to that, say that there was research within, I'd say, the first 3 months of the pandemic, at least here in Quebec, saying that 42% of people were looking to potentially change jobs at the end of the pandemic. And that was a year ago. And so the challenges have been there. I would say they pre-existed the pandemic. And it's just that now that things have settled, those organizations who haven't made the shift to look at how they need to shift doing things are the ones who are going to, I think, bear the brunt of that, unfortunately. In terms of how it's being communicated, I mean, I think there's a lot of variability, across different organizations. And I do think some have really realized that they need to implement a more flexible model with employees, that they need to slow things down to understand, where the challenges are, where the barriers are. And then there's others who are just sort of going full steam ahead without necessarily regard for the impact of that. I will admit those are typically not the organizations who want to work with somebody like me, because often they're so sort of stuck in implementing the plan as is. They don't necessarily see or I guess maybe prioritize the impact of that. But when there's not enough gathering of information from all levels of the organization to understand, how has this pandemic been, impacting you? What is needed with a return to make you most successful in your role, while also communicating the needs of the organization, and figuring out a way not to meet everyone's needs, but to make decisions that take those factors into consideration. It's I think certainly going to contribute to much greater levels of unhappiness and turnover and burnout and all the rest.
Absolutely, yeah. And what would you say about, we hear, I guess, a lot about values, mission, vision, values of a company, and for most companies, that's some, dusty plaque on a wall that no one's actually set eyes on in years, and most employees wouldn't be able to tell the mission, vision, values of their organization. How have you seen the pandemic change that? Do you think that's being communicated more, or is it more showing the true colors of the organization, whether they're being spoken about or not?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in some ways it really is showing the true colors of the organization, right? In terms of, if you look in the early days, right, in terms of how organizations were managing, do we lay people off? Do we cut executive salaries? Do we allow work from home? Do we wait until the government mandates it? When there's a case of COVID, if government restrictions allow us to keep everyone in the office, even if they feel unsafe, do we force them to, even if their work doesn't actually require their physical presence? Or, do we only look at that in the case where a physical presence is necessary, say in hospitals and other industries, of course. And so I think those kinds of factors are really showing what the underlying values of the organization are, regardless of what is written on paper. And I think that that was probably there to begin with, but with the stress levels people were experiencing and the realization of what it might be like to not, be in that environment on a daily basis, it's a wake-up call to some of, do I want to return back to that? And depending on what the organization is like and how that fit is for the individual, that may feel like a perfect match, or it may feel like you couldn't pay me $1 million to set foot back in there again. But, I think that awakening moment is getting to step out of the really stressful situation to look at, wow, look how much different things could be.
Yeah. Awesome. And so how does that go? How does that fit with neuroscience? Like what does the research say about how our brains are functioning, and particularly during times of stress?
Yeah, so I'll absolutely walk you through the neuroscience of stress and the impact that has on communication. And I will say that this has all been present prior to the pandemic. I think the pandemic has really just been the significant stressor that has made the impact so significant. And so basically and I'll do this in a nutshell and as simple a terms as possible, but our prefrontal cortex and sort of the frontal part of the brain, that's responsible for all of our executive functioning skills. So things like problem solving, being able to see things from different angles, be really flexible in our thinking, come up with varied solutions to a problem, such as what do I do when, it's time to return people to the office and not everyone wants to? How can I think flexibly while still having some structure and meeting the needs of the organization? It involves skills like impulse control. So when I'm upset, am I impulsively lashing out at you, or am I able to restrain my impulse? And that example links to emotional regulation too, right? So when I'm experiencing intense emotions, do I have the skills to be able to kind of settle my body even though I'm angry, versus I get into a state where my anger makes it such that I'm so mobilized, my body is so mobilized that I'm communicating in a way that afterwards I kind of regret, and so there's all sorts of different skills, but those are the executive functioning skills. And then what happens is that under times of significant stress, the part of the brain that manages our emotions, the limbic system, which is, the amygdala is part of the limbic system. It manages our fear response. That becomes really activated, and it can actually overshadow our ability to use our executive functioning skills. And so we start to not be able to tap into our impulse control, our flexible thinking, our problem solving, and all of those skills as well. And then there's also the brainstem, which can put us into fight, flight, freeze, or now there's a relatively new reaction called fawn, where we're just reacting without really reflecting, right? It's all of these automatic reactions. And so what happens is when we're under stress, because our executive functioning skills aren't as accessible, we're not as easily able to communicate with people in a way where we're able to kind of step back and explore difference of opinion. We're able to respect that you might see things differently than myself, and that doesn't make you wrong nor me. We're able to work through problems together. And so really understanding the neuroscience of our stress response and putting in place strategies to manage and sort of resolve that stress cycle that we experience is part of what can help you show up and communicate in a way that is more collaborative versus just kind of unleashing your frustration onto someone else.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, I heard a great analogy from, I'm going to forget the presenter's name now, but he calls it dropping markers, where you have, normally if you have a whole, like when I'm old, the old Crayola pencil crayon box with all the whatever 64 colors. And so when we're calm and relaxed and we're in our element, we have access to the whole palette of options to choose from. We can be creative, but the more stressed we get, the more options get taken out of that. So essentially we end up with one or two things, and those are typically those deep ingrained habits that, fight or flight, or something that we're not able to speak the nuances of what we're saying. And so I think that's fits exactly with how what you mentioned about the neuroscience and how our brain reacts.
Well, and if I can add to that, so, and I think it can be cumulative, so chronic over time. And I think the analogy you just shared can probably apply to both of the examples I'm going to share, but it can be cumulative, so that over time we've experienced so many chronic stressors that we get down to only having two markers. And I wake up every day with only two markers to use. And so then, we need to look at, what do I need to put in place to get those markers back, I guess, or in my work I call it the reactive zone of communication and the receptive zone of communication. And so when you have a lot of markers, you would be in a receptive zone, and when you start to only have a few markers left, you're in a more reactive zone. So it can be chronic, or it can also be you wake up with, I don't know, 25 markers, and then there's an accident on the highway, and I don't know, your project, you realize that the deliverable hasn't come in, and now you can't, all of those things, and those markers are slowly going away throughout the day. And so I think when we look at stress management and the impact on communication, we have to look at both in a sort of short-term timeline of what do I need to put in place to manage that on a short-term scale, but also long-term based on the pileup of the chronic stressors. And I think that's where the pandemic has really taken away a lot of markers from a lot of people that haven't gotten them back.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point, because I tend to always think of that analogy on, if my wife and I have an argument or something, it's like that acute situation where you get reactive or defensive, and all of a sudden, a bunch of markers drop, and it can take a bit of time to pick them back up. But you make a great point. Yeah, if people are continually in that stress response, they're never able to pick up the markers. They don't even know the markers are dropped. It's just like they're holding this one marker really tight, and it's like, right, this is what I've got, and I'm protecting it with my life.
and that's a perfect example, because look at how when you only have one marker, now you're not as flexibly thinking, yes, I could color in another color, because all you can think of is, oh my goodness, I only have one marker left. I have to protect this with my life. And so if you look, to extrapolate to a business context, if you're looking, for instance, at the impact of the pandemic on different people, how many markers it has taken may depend on, somebody who absolutely loved working from home. They might come back with more markers than they had before. Whereas someone else may, through various experiences through the pandemic, financial impacts, problems with their children, somebody dying from COVID, other things perhaps not related to COVID even, may have taken a lot more markers. And I think there's a bit of a focus in our society on how it's entirely the individual's responsibility to get their markers back, right? And so you just need to do more yoga, or you aren't prioritizing yourself enough. And I think all those things are important, and they're absolutely a piece of the puzzle. But I think from an employer's perspective, it's also looking at, are the requirements that I'm expecting already taking away a lot of markers from this person? So if somebody is way more effective working from home, then I'm taking markers away already. Or if someone's way more effective in the office, that I'm taking markers away, making them work at home in a context where it's safe to come back. And so that's where I think looking at not the absolute individual needs of every single person in every single context, but trying to get a grasp on what takes away markers overall, what gives them back. Is there a hybrid solution? Then the individual has more markers left to go do yoga, to also add more markers to their box. So, I think that sort of a joint focus on how to set this up in a way that meets everyone's needs a bit better, gets the best outcomes ultimately.
Yeah. And that leads into, I guess, the next thing. There's always that saying that people don't quit their job, they quit their leader. And so what can leaders do to better that communication or improve that communication?
Yeah. So I'll say that in my experience, I find that when people reach out to me for my services, quite often they're already coming with a predetermined idea of what they want and what is going to best support their team, let's say, or sometimes themselves. That's a different scenario. And often when I start to explore, there hasn't necessarily been a lot of work done around trying to understand what is it that the employees actually want, or what are the challenges from their perspective. So even if you look at it in terms of conflict, so not necessarily pandemic related, although I do think the pandemic has, because we are under more stress, led to more conflict. But often there's this notion of the team needs to develop X skills so that they can deal with conflict more effectively. And sometimes the issue is a bit bigger than that. And so really the biggest thing I would suggest is, before getting to the solution, explore what the actual problem is with all of the parties involved, and do it in a way that is truly open-minded to actually identify the real underlying barriers. And that's hard because we're most often all a part of it. And we don't necessarily like to hold the pieces that we are a part of, because that takes vulnerability. It takes accepting, our imperfections. But until we're really looking at all of the pieces, including our own, my experience is that we're doing patchwork and band-aids, and it's almost worse than doing nothing, because the team has hope that things may change, and then the deflation after of, oh, we learned these new skills, but we can't implement them because, when we try to implement these changes, we're shut down, and then they're even more deflated than when nothing was being done.
Yeah, there's a lot of, we see that on the wellness side all the time. Companies talk a good game about wellness, and then certain programs try and get implemented. People learn new skills. They want to engage with the program, and it gets shut down by a leader, a department, or even the unwritten rules in the company of what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah.
And
well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, so I was going to say, and I also don't believe, I don't think it's feasible to never implement anything until all of the kinks are worked out. And I'm guessing you would agree with me on that. And so I certainly don't mean, don't take steps towards resolving issues until you've fully discovered every little element and have the 10-year plan of how you're going to resolve that, because that's just a whole other basket of problems. But I think both create both sort of extremes of quick fix, resolve this now, plan it all out, and only implement once we have it all figured out, cause different but similar, just as many, I should say, problems. And so sort of that middle ground of explore a bit, find, the next solution, test it out, see how it works, regroup, assess what worked, what didn't. It's that continuous process, I think, of gathering feedback from everyone that really leads you to kind of better resolve more of these challenges in a sustainable fashion.
And how does that, I guess, what best practices have you seen for companies to help provide some of that, I guess, the best skills to teach leaders how to communicate more effectively? Because I know in my experience, there are some leaders that are amazing communicators, and in the same company, at the same level in that company, you can have someone else that their department's a train wreck because they're not communicating things well. And as an executive leader looking at, call it, middle level managers, how do you make sure the communication skills are being developed, but also that there's some consistency across the employee experience in the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like the way you frame that, because I do think, so my experience has shown me that when I'm involved without executive buy-in, now that does not necessarily mean that they need to be present and participating in every step of what is done, but when there's not actual buy-in, true buy-in, not just I'll sign the check, but I actually want to improve this. And again, we'll reflect on if there's things I need to do or the organization needs to do to support that, then it's just money spent. And so when there's an actual, I guess, belief or buy-in that communication skills are a big foundation to not only employee well-being, but outcomes, right? Because if you think of all the time spent people navigating conflict, people complaining in the hallways or on one-on-one Zoom calls. That's a big cost. And again, both on I'd say a personal level in terms of the stress that adds to individuals and many individuals, but also to the bottom line. So when there's a true buy-in to that being important, to me, that's the biggest key. And then you can look at, okay, what, where is the organization now? Has there never been anything done in this regard? Well, that team is going to start at a different level than a team who has been focusing on this for 10 years. And now we're looking at getting into really refined, specific situations that different people are struggling with differently. And so I think really, again, looking at first doing a needs analysis of where are people, what is the biggest need, what are the resources available, and so are we talking starting with a training on, and again, on what level, based on what challenges are present and what strengths are there. Are we looking at a combination of training and ongoing individualized coaching? And so I think it really depends on the nuances, and then just biting off a piece at a time, so it doesn't mean, even if you identify that, yes, this team could use, this bigger, I'll say, quote unquote, intervention, it doesn't mean that has to be done today. But really, again, I guess it comes back to the same answer of not jumping in too quick with a solution until you've identified what is the best value for your money. Because at the end of the day, if you're spending money on support that isn't a good fit for your teams, they're not going to really implement the change. They haven't bought into the process. And you're going to conclude that that was no good. Whereas maybe the mismatch was more the fit of what kind of support was needed from the beginning.
Yeah. And so on that note, what are some of the key categories of training that companies may pursue? You had mentioned or individualized coaching. What other areas are key things that you see that companies benefit from?
So, I mean, I have a training format that I use that has 4 different sets. So my model of communication for leadership is, the first module is knowing yourself, right? So understanding what factors make you more reactive in your communication. And this is very individualized, right? So what is going to take markers away from me and make me more reactive is going to be different than you, Tim, or other people listening. So it's not, for me, the key is not being prescriptive in this is how to manage a team, but rather walk people through the self-reflections of how does this impact me personally in my leadership role. And so once they have a better grasp on understanding themselves and their strengths and weaknesses within communication as a leader, the next step is looking at managing reactions, right? So where are my strengths and weaknesses? What kind of tools can I put in place to manage my reactions? Now, not my emotions, because emotions are there to tell us something is not working. So it's not that you can't be upset. It's, again, being able to settle yourself so that you can deal with it more effectively. And also, how do you manage reactions in others, right? So that person who comes in the office disgruntled and ranting and raving, and this is, something that comes up a lot with leaders, I just want to close the door and kick them out because they're always complaining. So how do I manage my reactions in others? The next step is understanding others. So there we really look at communication skills to approach difference of opinion and conflict with curiosity and without judgment, and to look at how to create connection first so that we can work together while also setting limits. And then the last part is adapting leadership. And that really looks at understanding executive functioning better. How does that impact my work? How does that impact the team members' work? Where is there a mismatch that's affecting performance? And so really where people start, whether they do that whole program, whether they do pieces of it, kind of depends on the discussion I'll have with clients from the get-go, and see where, if we're doing a training, it's where sort of the majority of people. And then sometimes there is coaching or group sort of debrief sessions in between where we look at questions and answers and problem solving around specific challenges and how to apply the information there. Because I think that a piece that's often missing with training is the training is delivered, and then when you try to implement and get stuck, you don't know where to go. And so there's lots of different options in terms of, I think, where to start at communication. But my reflection is that very often people want to start at a very surface level. So for instance, do setting norms around when we email and when we Slack and when we do Zoom calls. And it's not that those norms aren't important to establish, but that doesn't really resolve a true communication challenge where people feel that their needs aren't being taken into consideration. It just outlines more policy. So starting the other way, and from that, then you'll get a lot of clarity on what kind of policies and procedures need to be in place to support the varied needs within the organization.
Okay. And in terms of different levels in the organization, different people, are there different training programs for that? Like one of the things we chatted about before was positional power and the impact of that on communication. Mm-hmm. So if you're coming from the C-suite, what does your communication say versus a middle level manager or an entry level, line level employee?
Yeah. So I will say that I'm asked this question a lot in terms of, in fact, I was recently speaking with somebody that I'm on the verge of doing some ongoing work with about, can you do one training on how to up manage and one training on how to, manage down, and one training on how to manage sort of laterally across the organization? And my response was that, in my opinion, there are some nuances in the challenges, but the skills required to do so are actually not that different, because it comes down to noticing your own patterns with that positional power within the organization. So for instance, when somebody who's in a position of authority challenges something you say, dismisses you, doesn't leave space for your voice, how does that impact you? Do you continue to stay calm and advocate? Do you shut down? Do you become really aggressive and belligerent? And then in turn, how do you interact when you're the person in a position of authority? And I find that what most people notice, if they start to really look at their patterns, is that there are times when or not times, there are differences in how they'll respond based on where they are in that hierarchy of authority. And so starting to notice how that impacts our communication is pretty powerful. And I'll give you an example from my personal life. This is something I've worked on a lot myself personally. And yet, for some reason, when I am in a healthcare setting, and I come from healthcare, but when I am with my kids navigating health issues, I find it much more difficult when I'm with a doctor who is dismissive of my concerns to not get really irritated, because it has happened to me a lot. And then I do not advocate as well. And so now, knowing that, and it's been a while I've known that, it is, I can remind myself in that moment that the way the communication is going, I have a tendency to, and it depends on the personality, sometimes I just give up, and sometimes I really get into arguing, but neither is ideal to resolve the problem. And so having that awareness is really key to be able to do what you need to get back to that receptive zone of communication and work through that problem a bit better. So it's not so much that there's different training programs for different levels. It's more, I would say, depending on whether you spend a lot of time in the your role is at the executive level, and you've maybe been socialized that leadership is done through authority, that may be something you're more accustomed to, versus if you, are in a position where you've been socialized to do what authority says,
And, a lot, this amazing information and very important for people and organizations. this is the Working Well podcast, and it goes back to employee health and well-being. And, I see a direct link, but a lot of people, I think, sometimes think, why are you talking about communication on a wellness podcast? But this is the foundation of people get upset and frustrated and disgruntled at work. And one of the key components of wellness is organizational. Do people feel they have a voice and a purpose at work? And if they're struggling to communicate that or not feeling that from leadership or even peers, then yeah, absolutely, that increases stress. It increases burnout. All kinds of negative health consequences come from that. And so in terms of overall communication, how do you see that affecting employee performance and organizational performance?
Well, I'm biased, obviously, since communication is my field. And I will nevertheless say that, to me, in my opinion, and research does support this, it has a huge impact. And so research actually shows that in organization, now this is pre-COVID, so I'm scared to see what the numbers will look like today.
Yeah.
But that employees spend 3 hours of work a week in conflict with others. And so if you start to do the math of how much that costs across an organization, we're talking massive amounts of money, right? And so if you were to say to a CEO, hey, how about, just for fun, you start giving everybody 3 hours of extra paid vacation a week, you're going to get resistance to that, most likely, right? If you're just throwing that idea out. And yet the reality is that money is being spent on people in conflict. And so that's time at the office. But then, as you've referenced, the weight of unresolved conflict. So not conflict. Conflict in itself is not a problem, because that's, I think, necessary to work out issues. It's unproductive conflict that doesn't get resolved. And so I think everybody can identify with a situation in their life, probably bazillions of situations in their life, where there has been a conflict at the office that they have taken home, complained about for a couple hours to their partner or their friend or on social media, returned the next day, talked about it in the hall, been really frustrated. And that, if you think of how your body felt, how your stress levels felt, how you slept when that was going on, that's an impact on our wellness. And I think the other problem is that when that's a one-off, fine, it's stressful, it gets resolved, we move on. When it's chronic, it gets our bodies, to get back to the neuroscience, it gets our bodies in a state where that stress response is chronically activated, and we can't as easily resolve that stress cycle. And so then the long-term impact on performance and well-being just starts to, it's like it's
a negative spiral.
Yeah.
We talk about that on the health, the physical side, the stress hormones, all the impact it has on even at the cellular function. You're not as resilient physically or mentally in that situation. And the longer that persists, the steeper the decline. And we're seeing that so much every day, because 15 months into this, so many issues haven't been resolved. There's just been stress was already one of the most impactful things on health pre-pandemic. And now we've had 15 months of everything loaded on again. And that's not being resolved. People are less active. They're not moving their body as much. They're staring at a screen all day, not taking care of themselves, and not communicating as well as they should.
Well, and they're crankier because of all that. So I hear myself when you're saying that. I used to go to the gym 5 times a week. I meditated all the time. I had all the life strategies in place. And now I still work out, but not as intensely as before. I skip it more often. The kids are home. We're homeschooling. And so in terms of my own reactivity, the first 6 months of the pandemic felt like a vacation. I loved the work from home. Awesome. And then as we started experiencing some other stressors, some health issues in our kids, I could feel my reactive zone getting larger. And so the things that would irritate me I would get irritated more quickly. I was having a harder time, staying on top of things because, again, your executive functioning is getting fuzzier. And so, to just loop back to what you were saying, I think there's a perception that, yay, the pandemic's going to be over. We're all going to run back to the office and everything will just go back to the way it was. And I actually think that's really, really not logical thinking, because some people are coming in a much more heightened state of stress. And I would say that some of the, in situations where people have not felt well supported by the organization, or where they felt that their current challenges were not understood. So I've certainly heard a lot of people talking about how performance expectations didn't change, even though, people had kids at home and all sorts of challenges. There's resentment that has not been cleared because you haven't had the conversations you need to. And so I think we need to really keep that in mind as we transition back to the office, that those unresolved issues need to be brought to the forefront, or they're going to continue to simmer underground until a fire starts. And I'm actually just thinking, there were some kids playing fireworks in our park last weekend. And as they went off, we were like, oh, it's dangerous. And like 40 minutes later, looked outside to a fire. It took 40 minutes of, the embers in the garbage before that fire sparked and the park was on fire. We had to call 911. That's what's going to happen in organizations, but it might not take 40 minutes. It may take months and months. And then the problem is, often we won't look at what we want to do to resolve it until the whole park is on fire. So my suggestion is, do that now preventatively. It'll cost you way less money than waiting for the huge fire, because people aren't going to want to leave the same way and they'll feel more supported, and you're not going to be dealing with as many burnouts. And again, the performance impact of not addressing it.
Yeah, excellent. And so what, I mentioned it a bit earlier, but what can companies do to help with this? We mentioned some training around leadership communication around the 4 points that you'd mentioned. What other strategies and tools do companies have at their disposal to help with this?
Yeah.
Stop the fire, like Smokey the Bear.
Stop the fire. Yeah. Well, so I think part of it is, deciding that this is a priority, right? That this is something we're going to focus on. Outside of that, I would really say, from a leadership perspective, that modeling what you want to see put in place is really important. And so starting to look at yourself, right? Where does my communication miss the mark? And the reality is that it's not possible to always listen to everyone else perfectly, paint this picture that just is not realistic. We're human. So it's not so much about trying to communicate perfectly in all scenarios, but rather looking at what are the factors that impact my ability to listen to complaints within the team, to set limits as I need to be equally respectful of everyone's opinion. And once I've identified where I'm not quite as strong, also looking at where do I do really well? Like, what scenarios make it really easy for me to communicate effectively with my team? And how can I bring more of that into what I'm doing? And I think that's where that customization of, people learning the skills, but then figuring out how do I implement this in a way that works for me is key. And so by realizing, so for instance, let me make this a bit more concrete. I am someone that if I have back-to-back meetings, I get into the reactive zone, not even because I'm angry, but because my body just gets into a state of hyperarousal. That's just, I know that about myself. I wish it weren't the case. It's the way my body works. And so I know that I need to take time during my day to settle myself. I know that if I'm going to have a really difficult meeting where I disagree with someone and I have to work something hard out, don't do it coming off another Zoom call. Take 5 minutes and just breathe. and, set your intention to be able to go into there and listen. So little things like that sometimes can be a huge impact, can have a huge impact on how we're then able to connect with our team members. And not only does it help us, but I think it models to them the behaviors that they can be trying to also be able to, work on those same skills in the workplace.
Well, that's perfect example is what you said earlier is one of the first steps is knowing yourself. Knowing exactly what you need to do to get into the right mindset, to have tough conversations, or how to set up your day effectively to make sure you have energy and focus and enthusiasm to tackle what you need to tackle. And
right.
Yeah, that's something that we talk with companies a lot about on the wellness side is helping put those tools in place. I've got, you see in the corner down here, I've got my kettlebells and my roller, and like literally I'm in my office here, and if I have a couple minutes and I'm like going stir crazy, I will do a couple kettlebell exercises. I'll do a stretch. I'll, grab the roller and go into the other room and just roll and go out for a walk or something, because for me, that's something that helps me refocus. And if it's 30 seconds or it's 5 minutes, I come back feeling like a new person.
Yeah.
And I think, again, there are people try and put it into this box that applies to everyone, and not everyone is the same. So we have to be able to know that.
Well, and again, if you look at our stress responses, so you and I are both members of CAPS, the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers, and I had the chance to speak on stage as a rising star maybe 2-3 years ago. And as we were waiting to go on stage, I had headphones on and was listening to calm music, because I know that I have a tendency to get hyper aroused, and then I talk too fast. I forget what I wanted to say, and I get very scattered. And one of the other speakers who was about to go on said to me, "Oh, you need to get up and do jumping jacks, and we'll do a chant." And I was like, no, that's not good for me. Now, for me to say to him, "No, you need to do it my way," so my stress response is I get on a state of hyper arousal, my nervous system, whereas he may get into a state of hypo arousal where he kind of starts to shut down, and maybe he needs things to alert the body and wake himself up to refocus. And so that's where I think that, leaving space for individuals to adapt, they know, and if they need a walker, they need, whatnot. And I think sometimes we perceive those needs as, well, you're just trying to take advantage because you already went for a walk 2 hours ago, when the reality is, if I need a 10-minute walk to focus, you're going to get more out of me than if I just sit at my computer trying to make myself focus for 3 hours. So totally. I think it's a shift of mindset on a leadership level.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the note of the headphones on with the relaxing music, I'm more Metallica versus Kenny G.
Right.
So it's like, yeah,
right.
I'll be like, okay.
And you were like, that'll put me to sleep.
Surprisingly, it actually calms me to have, and like, it at least gets my mind off what's distracting it. And
well, because it's so if you look at regulation of the body, that loud music will alert the body, and calming music will soothe it. So again, it depends on, right now, does your body need to be alerted, or does it need to be calmed? And, your nervous system, I'm talking here. And I think that letting people explore what works for them then lets them find those things out. Like, I would never listen to heavy metal before a big conversation, because it would put me in a bad state, whereas you wouldn't listen to calming music, so it's actually not complex, right? That costs no money. No. It's just shifting our thinking on it, I think.
Yeah. And having the employee training and development in place to help people understand that, because while it's common knowledge to us, it's not to a lot of people. And a lot of people sit there and struggle. And you use the perfect example of sitting at the computer all day and trying to make themselves focus. It's like there are people doing that day in and day out every day, and wondering why they're unproductive, and they're performing below expectations, and their managers giving them performance reviews and things like that. And they're like, I'm working hard, I'm trying to do this, when it might be as simple as taking a step back, learning how to apply some of these principles, and improving their performance dramatically with very little effort put in. Mm-hmm. In fact, less effort.
And I'll say, so again, the link back to communication is that the easiest way to discover that is, rather than, performance evaluations and telling people what they need to do to be more effective, is exploring it with them. Hey, what's happening? Help walk them through the critical thinking process of identifying where the barriers are and what kind of supports could be tried. Is the easiest way to get to those solutions. And it doesn't mean that you figure them out magically, but when the person affected is involved in the discussion, if they're not, you're missing a huge part of the puzzle to begin with. So you're already playing with, 50% of the info that you need.
Yeah. Basic, going back to learning about the person, meeting them where they're at, helping them understand their needs and how you can help them improve.
Meeting them where they're at. You got it. That's the biggest key, isn't it?
Very cool. Awesome. Well, I know we could literally chat forever. I love chatting with you. Thank you so much for the insight and knowledge. What's one takeaway you want people to leave with? If it went in one ear and out the other, and they have one thing they're gonna take away and walk away with at the end that's of value, what would you say is the number one thing for people to learn about the neuroscience of leadership and communication?
So I haven't said this specifically, although I've alluded to it, but the biggest takeaway to me is that we can all make the decisions within our lives to start putting in place the changes needed to influence how communication works in the workplace. Situations that are not, they're causing stress to you, by focusing yourself on identifying, what tends to make you feel more reactive and what doesn't, learning skills to settle yourself to be able to engage in those conversations in a way that gets to more productive results. It does have impact. And I think a lot of people sometimes feel like it's too big of a beast, right? Sometimes these complex communication issues or, issues around people not feeling heard, but it all starts with you.
Awesome. Thank you again. This has been fantastic. And I know listeners will get tremendous value. Before we wrap up, where can people find you? Website, carrier pigeons. What's the best place to find you?
Hedwig's owl in Harry Potter.
The kids would love that. I heard my son has like this little daily calendar thing with all these funny stats on it. Apparently there was this fancy wedding in England where they wanted to they had an owl handler come in and to deliver the rings and it was supposed to fly across swoop over the heads of the people, come up and land on the guy's arm and deliver the rings. And it went straight up to the highest point in the church and fell asleep for like an hour.
Oh my goodness. I was going to say that sounds like a disaster before you'd even finish the story.
Thankfully they thought of it and they had a backup pair of rings that they used for the ceremony, but they said it was like a massive fail in terms of the owl.
I will share that with my kids. They're big Harry Potter fans, so I will share that. So you can certainly try to send Hedwig on over. Failing that, my website is lindsaylapaquette.com. So it's LindsayLapaquette.com. I do have a little video e-course, 6 modules on to help you free yourself from workplace conflict and confrontation. So you can check that out there. It's on the homepage. And feel free to reach out and connect on LinkedIn also.
All right. Excellent. I will put those details in the show notes to make sure that everyone has a link that links directly to your website. But excellent. Thank you again so much. And I look forward to catching up again soon. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Thank you for listening to the Working Well podcast. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. We love to hear your experiences and how you've applied tips from the show to your daily life. So please keep us posted on your progress. To stay up to date with new episode releases, make sure to subscribe to our mailing list by emailing podcast@freshgroup.ca and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And once again, I'm Tim Boris with Fresh Wellness Group. We'll see you on the next episode.